What do you do with a ship you can't destroy and can't let pass? The motor tanker Winya. 300,000 tons of Iranian fuel oil, a crew that wouldn't pick up the radio, and a flag that changed twice while the helicopters were still crossing the water. Put a warhead through her hull and the Gulf of Oman burns for a week. Wave her through and you've confirmed the disguise works. And the 24 ships running the same game right behind her know it. She was built to be untouchable. For most of July she was. The answer, when it came, wasn't a smarter weapon or a louder radio call. It was a flight of UH-1Y Venoms off the deck of USS Boxer, AH-1Z Vipers flying escort, crossing open water toward a tanker still at full speed. Marines went down the ropes. A few minutes later, the ship, her oil, her crew, and her papers were American, not sunk, taken. But before any of that was possible, the boarding party had to solve a problem with nothing to do with helicopters or ropes. They couldn't prove whose ship she was. She'd been swapping her broadcast name mid-chase and raised a new flag just as the rotors came overhead, a floating identity that changed its face every few hours. The disguise meant to protect her had made it legally impossible to call her Iranian from a distance, and under maritime law, that gap mattered. The only way to close it was to put a man on her deck and read her papers himself. The crew knew that too. A ship too loaded to shoot, too valuable to release, and too slippery to identify at range should have made it through. She didn't. And the reason begins with the one thing her designers never thought to defend against. By mid-July, after a spring and summer of escalation, the United States had a full naval blockade across the Strait of Hormuz, in force since the 14th. Iran was out of the legal oil market. For Central Command, that made the job harder than simply stopping ships, because the ships weren't all the same problem, and the right call for one could be exactly wrong for the next. A country under sanctions doesn't move its oil with warships, it moves it with disguises. That's what a shadow fleet is. Merchant vessels that look legitimate on paper, but run to disappear from the tracking systems the West depends on. Around 24 Iran-linked tankers were working the waters near Hormuz, and most were empty. Decoys pushing through the strait to soak up surveillance so no one could tell which cargo actually mattered. Winya was the one that mattered. Hold the problem the way Central Command held it, because every obvious answer was already gone. Shooting her out was off the table. Days earlier, the Navy had put a hellfire into an empty shadow tanker, Belma, and wrecked her engines. Clean, because an empty hull has nothing to lose. Winya carried 300,000 tons of fuel oil. Drive a warhead into that and you don't seize anything. You get an environmental disaster, a burning crew, and the destruction of the very cargo you were trying to keep from Tehran. Her cargo was her armor. But she couldn't be waved through either. A ship this size moving through means roughly 2 million barrels delivered, tens of millions of dollars to the Revolutionary Guard. Letting her pass would confirm the disguise holds, opening the lane for every vessel behind her. Ordering her to stop was no better. She was ignoring all calls, and a fully loaded supertanker doesn't turn around because a warship said so. No missile, no waving her through, no radio. One option left, and not a clean one. Put people on her deck, because nothing else was going to work. From here, this becomes a Marine story, and it starts with a problem they had to solve before anyone was cleared to touch her. Nobody could confirm whose ship she was. Under the law of the sea, a vessel flying a national flag is floating territory of that nation. Fire on something flying San Marino's colors, and you may have handed a third country grounds for a confrontation. Before anyone lays a hand on a vessel, the United States has to establish one thing: whose ship is this? Winya had been built so that question had no clean answer. She kept cycling through broadcast identities on the run, first Nanjing, then Ajin, then back. She flew the flag of San Marino, a landlocked country with no coastline, a tell so obvious it almost seemed deliberate. She spoofed her position. This wasn't really a ship so much as a floating identity in a series of masks. And here the disguise backfired. Because nobody could say with confidence whose ship she was, the Navy couldn't simply declare her Iranian and move. Central Command had to treat it as a flag verification boarding, meaning the only way to settle the question was to put a Marine on that deck and read the papers himself. Iran's own camouflage had routed the entire problem straight to the boarding team. Then came the last card. As the helicopters closed in, the crew hauled down the San Marino flag and raised the colors of the Islamic Republic of Iran. A final gamble. I'm Iranian territory now. Touch me, and it's a war between nations. At the exact moment the mask came off, the Marines were already overhead. The disguise had bought her everything, right up until it didn't. So the method chose itself. Board her. The trouble is that boarding a supertanker at full speed is its own problem. It happened the United States had a force right there, built for exactly this. This was never a Coast Guard job. The water was thick with threats, anti-ship missiles, one-way attack drones, Revolutionary Guard fast attack craft. The mission went to the Boxer Amphibious Ready Group and the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, a self-contained Marine air-ground task force that carries the firepower of a small brigade and floats on station ready to move. At the center sits USS Boxer, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship, roughly the size of a light carrier, with a full-length flight deck on top and a floodable well deck in the hull. She's why this force can operate on its own: an airfield, a barracks, and a command post in one hull. When Winya was picked for boarding, the plan was built around Boxer, the platform the helicopters would launch from and return to. The Marines stepping onto Winya came from Battalion Landing Team 350s. Their trade is VBs, visit, board, search, and seizure, and they drill it constantly. Live fire on a pitching deck, close quarters work in the dark, rope work, the full grammar of taking a ship from the people running it. The aircraft carrying them were UH-1Y Venoms of Marine Medium Tiltrotor 163, the utility helicopter built to put a squad exactly where it needs to land, with Viper gunships overhead as escort. None of it was improvised on the day. Every aircraft, every rifle belonged to one self-contained force, trained for precisely this. So how do you actually get on her? Not up the side? Climbing a supertanker from a boat is asking for trouble. A hook ladder against a steel wall that can stand 90 feet out of the water. A crew above cutting the line or running a fire hose down on your head. Every second of the climb slow and exposed with surprise long gone. The side of the ship is the one direction she can actually defend. So they came from the one direction she couldn't. Straight down from the sky. That's vertical envelopment. You skip the sides and land on top. The same high steel wall that makes her impossible to climb gives you a vast, flat main deck to drop onto. The Venoms lifted off Boxer's flight deck, crossed open water, and came into a hover over the tanker's deck and bridge, with Boxer herself holding back over the horizon, running the whole operation as the command post. The Marines went down the ropes onto a ship still at full speed, fast roping, 30 seconds or so from the rope to boots on steel, and she could do nothing about it. A loaded supertanker needs more than a nautical mile just to change heading. She can't dodge a helicopter. From above, she was essentially stationary. The Vipers stayed up the whole time, weapons ready for any shoulder-fired threat the guard might have nearby. From the first sound of rotors to the first boot on the deck was seconds. The crew barely had time to register it before there were Marines on the steel. The physical part was done. Except getting aboard was never the dangerous part. That came right after. They were now armed Marines on a ship full of fuel, a crew somewhere below with intentions nobody yet knew, and that's where the real work started. Here's what the boarding team couldn't see. A supertanker's main deck runs close to 1,000 feet. A long stretch of pipework, tank hatches, and blind corners, with the superstructure and engine plant buried deep at the stern. Somewhere in or below it was a crew. Unarmed sailors ready to raise their hands, a security detail waiting behind a hatch, someone already at the bridge, or already heading down into the hull. The force that came from the sky knew the ship's shape from schematics. It had no idea what was moving inside her. Every door was a question being answered in real time by people the Marines hadn't seen yet. That's why they don't try to hold the whole ship. They push for 2 points and nothing else. One team goes for the bridge, because whoever controls it decides where 300,000 tons goes. Until it's taken, she can still run for Iranian waters. But it's the second point that puts time against them. Deep in the hull is the engine room, and with it the Kingston valves, sea valves that open below the waterline. A crew that would rather scuttle than surrender needs only reach those valves and open them, and the ship, cargo, papers and all, heads for the bottom of the Gulf of Oman. Scuttling is one of the oldest moves at sea, and the Marines clearing passageways above have no way of knowing whether someone is already down there reaching for a handle. So the whole thing runs blind. Both teams push inward at once, toward the bridge and into the engineering spaces, through a vessel whose layout they've memorized from paper and whose crew they've never met. Every sealed hatch a potential problem, every passageway cleared corner by corner. Speed matters here, not for show, but because every second of movement is a second someone could be in that engine room. Secure the engine spaces, and she can't be sunk from within. Secure the bridge, and collect the crew, and she stops fighting entirely. What's left is what they came for. The ship, her cargo, her people, all in one piece, all in American hands. That's the whole difference from Belma. A ship you can question is worth more than one on the seabed. Only then could anyone answer the question the whole operation started with: whose ship is this? The Marines pulled the registration documents and compared them against the broadcast names and the flag that had gone up the mast. They didn't match. That mismatch was the answer: an Iranian vessel wearing someone else's paperwork. One last thing to confirm: the reason this hull was worth boarding out of 24. Was she carrying? Or was she a decoy? They checked the tanks. Full, 300,000 tons of Iranian fuel oil. A real node in the network, with a Marine on deck who could say so, which is exactly why she was taken intact rather than destroyed. A ship on the seabed tells you nothing. A captured one opens her logs, her communications with the management company in Dubai that ran her, the manifest, the fingerprints of every ship-to-ship transfer. Every page a thread back into the network. Stopping this one delivery was never really the point. Making the ship give up the others was. Give the Shadow Fleet its credit. It was a smart system. Spoofed signals, flag hopping, decoy hulls. It had beaten the initial blockade and pushed dozens of ships through. It was built by people who understood exactly the weaknesses of the force watching for them. This wasn't carelessness being punished. But every one of those defenses, the layered identity, the sheer displacement, the full cargo, had been built against the threat she expected: a missile or a satellite watching from distance. She had no answer at all for a squad standing on her own deck reading her papers. That's the whole story. America didn't reach for a heavier weapon. It stopped playing the game the ship was built to win and switched to one she'd never been designed to survive: a boarding, followed by a search. The same logic ran across all of July 16th. The blockade handled 3 ships that day and treated each differently. Winya boarded and kept, too valuable to destroy. Belma, empty, put down. 3 more turned back over the radio without anyone touching them. The tool matched the ship in front of it, which is what a working enforcement operation looks like. Taking Winya settled nothing larger. She's one link, and the network is still out there, but it showed the link could be reached, boarded, and read. USS Boxer and the Marines didn't defeat Winya. They changed the angle. Every straightforward answer had been ruled out. Too loaded to sink, too valuable to release, too evasive to name at range. One road left: work out who she was, come down from above, take the bridge and the engine room before the crew could scuttle her, then read her rather than wreck her. Everything that shielded her from a missile left her open to men dropping from the sky. It was never about a heavier weapon. It was about coming at her from the one direction she wasn't built to stop. And here's what the whole operation quietly depended on. None of it started until someone had already found her. Picked this one hull out of 24 that looked the same, half of them empty decoys built to waste exactly that effort. The boarding was the easier half. The hard half was finding a ship that spent every hour trying not to be found. No boots or ropes, just sensors, patience, and a watch wide enough to catch something that doesn't want to be caught.